Walk into a room, and before a single word is spoken, something already hits you. Not sound, not sight, something deeper. Pressure, atmosphere, emotional static in the air, like an invisible signal only a few nervous systems are built to decode. Most people miss it completely. But some don't miss anything at all. They feel the tension in the silence. They register the shift in tone before the sentence is even formed. They absorb what others are trying to hide while pretending nothing is happening. And over time, something strange begins to appear in these individuals. They don't age like everyone else. Not in a poetic way. Not in a mystical way. In a biological way that most people misunderstand. Because aging is not just skin deep. It never was. Aging is a nervous system story. Your biology is constantly being rewritten by what your mind treats as normal. Stress hormones, emotional load, sleep disruption, chronic vigilance, internalized tension. These are not just experiences. They are instructions to the body, and some minds receive more emotional data per second than they were ever designed to handle. These are the people who don't just understand emotion, they simulate it internally. A smile doesn't stay on the surface. It gets processed. A sad voice doesn't pass through them. It lands inside them. A room full of anxiety doesn't stay external. It becomes internal weather. Their nervous system behaves like an amplifier with no off switch. And that is where aging begins to split into two directions, because the same sensitivity that creates deep perception also creates biological cost. When emotional signals are constantly absorbed instead of filtered, the body stays in a low-grade survival response. Cortisol rises, recovery drops, sleep becomes lighter, the immune system shifts from repair to defense, and over time, the face starts reflecting what the nervous system is carrying. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly, unmistakably. Some faces develop hardness, others develop depth. One is defense, the other is experience. Inside the brain, highly sensitive individuals often show heightened activity in systems responsible for social mapping and emotional mirroring. That means when someone else feels something, the observer doesn't just understand it logically. It gets internally reconstructed. The brain doesn't say they are stressed. The brain begins to simulate stress, and the body obeys the simulation. This is where the paradox forms, because the same system that creates deep empathy also creates biological overload. When emotional exposure becomes chronic, cortisol doesn't just rise temporarily, it becomes a background condition. And prolonged cortisol exposure affects far more than mood. It alters collagen production. It disrupts deep sleep cycles. It increases inflammation. It weakens immune response. It changes how the brain stores emotional memory. Over time, stress doesn't just sit in thoughts. It embeds in tissue. And that is why two people can live similar lives but age completely differently. It is not just events. It is how deeply those events enter the nervous system. But here is where the pattern becomes even more interesting. Not all stress damages equally. The human system doesn't respond only to intensity. It responds to interpretation. Two individuals can experience identical emotional environments, yet one collapses internally while the other remains stable. The difference is not external. It is regulatory. One absorbs everything. The other filters meaning. And this is where maturity changes biology. Early sensitivity often looks like emotional over-responsibility, carrying other people's states, trying to fix emotional chaos, confusing presence with obligation, staying inside environments that continuously overload the nervous system. The body doesn't distinguish between emotional and physical threat. It only registers load. So over time, systems that were meant for perception become systems of exhaustion. Muscle tension becomes baseline. Gut sensitivity increases. Sleep becomes fragmented. The brain starts scanning constantly for emotional shifts before they fully form. Not because something is wrong, because the system has adapted to never fully relax. And what most people don't realize is that the nervous system remembers. It learns patterns of chaos and begins to expect them even in silence. That is why some people cannot fully relax even in safe environments. Safety feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels suspicious. Calm feels temporary, because their biology has been trained inside emotional unpredictability. And yet, there is another trajectory entirely, because when awareness enters the system, something begins to change. Not the sensitivity itself, but the direction of it. Instead of absorbing every emotional signal, the system begins to classify it. What belongs here, what does not. What is signal? What is noise? What is theirs? What is not theirs? This is where transformation begins, because once emotional input becomes filtered instead of absorbed, the nervous system stops running continuous background survival mode, and biology responds immediately. Sleep deepens, breathing slows, muscle tension releases, inflammation begins to reduce, energy returns, not because life becomes easier, but because internal processing becomes cleaner. And for the first time, the body is no longer carrying everyone else's emotional weight as if it were its own responsibility. This shift is subtle at first, a pause before reacting, a boundary that feels uncomfortable but necessary, a realization that emotional access is not automatic, a growing awareness that empathy without structure becomes self-consumption. And slowly, the system rewires. Because the brain is not fixed, it adapts to how it is used. Repeated emotional restraint strengthens regulatory pathways in the prefrontal regions. Emotional spikes no longer immediately hijack the system. Instead, there is space between feeling and reaction. That space changes everything. Because in that space, biology stops being dictated by emotional environment and starts being guided by internal control. And as this stabilizes, something unexpected happens externally. The face changes. Not dramatically, not artificially, but structurally over time. The constant microtension begins to fade. The eyes stop carrying continuous scanning behavior. The jaw softens. The expression becomes less reactive, more observant, not younger, more stable, because stability has its own visual signature. And this is where the misunderstanding happens in most people. They assume sensitivity leads to fragility. But that is only true when sensitivity has no boundaries. When boundaries enter the system, sensitivity becomes precision instead of overload, and precision is far more efficient than resistance. Because now emotional information is no longer flooding the system indiscriminately. It is being interpreted, sorted, and released instead of stored, and the body stops treating every emotional signal as an emergency. That alone changes aging trajectory more than most external factors ever could. Sleep becomes the primary repair mechanism again instead of fragmented recovery. Hormones stabilize instead of constantly fluctuating. Inflammatory markers decrease because the internal alarm system is no longer permanently activated. And with time, something else emerges. Perception sharpens, not emotionally reactive perception, pattern recognition, behavioral reading, micro-shift awareness, the ability to detect inconsistency before it becomes obvious. Because a system that is no longer overwhelmed by emotion begins to notice structure inside emotion, tone before words land, intent before sentences complete, patterns before repetition confirms them. And that creates a different kind of intelligence. One that is not loud, not reactive, not impulsive, but quietly precise. However, the most important shift is not external at all. It is internal neutrality, the ability to be present in emotional environments without becoming them, to witness intensity without absorbing it, to understand pain without carrying it, to engage without dissolving the self into the experience. And in that state, the nervous system is no longer in constant negotiation with survival. It simply operates efficiently, calmly, without unnecessary internal noise. And when that happens consistently over time, the body no longer ages as a record of emotional overload. It begins to reflect regulation instead, not absence of feeling, but mastery of exposure. And somewhere in that transition, the entire relationship between emotion and biology stops being destructive. Aging is not something that begins in the skin, and it never truly has been. What most people interpret as aging is only the final visible layer of a process that starts much deeper, inside the nervous system. Every emotional experience a person goes through is not just a moment of thought or feeling. It is a physiological event that triggers measurable changes in the body. When a person is under chronic stress, even if it is emotional rather than physical, the brain activates survival pathways that release stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals are not inherently harmful in short bursts, but when they remain elevated over long periods, they begin to reshape the body from the inside out. sleep becomes lighter, recovery slows down, and the immune system shifts its priority away from repair and toward defense. Over time, this constant state of internal alertness becomes the baseline, and the body begins to age not according to time, but according to stress exposure. The nervous system acts like a control center for biological aging because it determines how the body interprets the environment. If the environment is perceived as unsafe, even emotionally unsafe, the body reacts as if there is a continuous threat. This means that someone who is constantly exposed to emotional tension, conflict, or internalized stress is biologically behaving as if they are in survival mode. In this state, the body prioritizes immediate response over long-term maintenance. Processes like cellular repair, hormone balance, and deep restorative sleep are reduced because the system is focused on staying alert rather than healing. This is where aging begins to accelerate in ways that are not immediately visible, but accumulate silently over time. One of the most important discoveries in modern neuroscience is that emotional experiences are not separate from physical biology. Every emotional reaction has a chemical counterpart. When stress becomes frequent, cortisol levels remain high for extended periods, and this has a cascading effect on the entire body. High cortisol disrupts collagen production, which affects skin elasticity and structure. It interferes with sleep cycles, preventing the brain from entering deep restorative phases that are essential for repair. It also increases inflammation throughout the body, and chronic inflammation is now understood as one of the primary drivers of accelerated aging. This is why people under long-term emotional stress often appear older than their actual age, not because of genetics alone, but because their internal biological systems are constantly under pressure. The brain itself also changes under prolonged emotional load. Studies in neurobiology show that chronic stress can reduce the volume of areas responsible for emotional regulation and memory. This means that aging is not only physical, but also cognitive when stress is sustained over time. The mind becomes less flexible, more reactive, and more prone to fatigue. Emotional processing becomes heavier, and recovery from daily experiences takes longer. The nervous system begins to operate with less efficiency, meaning even small emotional triggers can produce large physiological responses. This creates a cycle where stress leads to overload, and overload leads to even greater sensitivity to stress. What makes this even more significant is that the body does not differentiate between types of stress. To the nervous system, emotional stress is treated with the same biological urgency as physical danger. This means that unresolved emotional tension, constant worry, or internalized pressure can have the same aging effect as physical strain. Over time, the body begins to carry emotional history in its physical state. Muscle tension becomes chronic, breathing patterns become shallow, and energy levels fluctuate without clear external cause. The accumulation of these small internal changes gradually shapes the visible signs of aging. However, this process is not fixed or irreversible. The nervous system is adaptive, which means it responds to patterns over time. When stress decreases and emotional safety increases, the body begins to shift out of survival mode. Cortisol levels normalize, sleep becomes deeper, and cellular repair processes activate more effectively. Inflammation decreases, and the body begins to redirect energy from defense to restoration. This is where biological aging can slow down significantly, not through external interventions alone, but through internal regulation of emotional load. Conclusion begins here. The first step is recognizing that emotional stress is not just psychological, it is biological and directly tied to aging. The second step is learning to reduce unnecessary emotional exposure and stop internalizing external chaos as personal responsibility. The third step is building emotional regulation skills that allow the nervous system to remain stable even in difficult environments. The final step is consistency, because long-term nervous system stability is what ultimately determines whether the body ages in a state of chronic stress or continuous recovery. Highly sensitive individuals do not experience emotions in the same way most people do. And this difference is not psychological alone, it is deeply neurological. Their brains are not just observing emotional information from the environment, they are internally recreating it. When someone near them feels stress, sadness, anger, or anxiety, the empathic nervous system does not remain detached. Instead, it mirrors that emotional state internally, almost as if the experience is happening within their own body. This is linked to heightened activity in neural systems responsible for emotional resonance and social awareness, often described in neuroscience as mirror systems. These systems are designed to help humans understand others, but in highly sensitive individuals, they operate at a much higher intensity. Because of this heightened internal simulation, emotional boundaries become the key factor that determines whether sensitivity becomes a strength or a burden. When there are no clear boundaries, every emotional environment is absorbed without filtering. A conversation that carries tension does not stay outside the body, it enters it. A room filled with anxiety does not remain observational, it becomes physiological. Over time, this constant emotional absorption creates a condition where the nervous system is rarely at rest. It moves from one emotional state to another based on external input without enough time to reset. This creates biological fatigue that is often misunderstood as physical tiredness, when in reality, it is emotional overload stored in the nervous system. In this state of continuous absorption, the body begins to interpret emotional input as survival data. Every subtle change in tone, expression, or energy becomes significant. The nervous system becomes hyper-alert, scanning constantly for emotional shifts. While this heightened awareness can create deep empathy and strong intuition, it also comes with a cost. The system never fully disengages from processing. Even after leaving an emotionally intense environment, the mind continues replaying, analyzing, and re-experiencing what was absorbed. This delayed processing means that emotional experiences are not confined to the moment. They extend far beyond it, keeping the nervous system active long after the event has ended. Over time, this internal simulation of others' emotional states can lead to a blurred distinction between self and environment. The individual may struggle to identify which emotions belong to them and which are absorbed from others. This creates internal confusion and emotional fatigue because the system is constantly processing layers of emotional input that are not self-generated. Without awareness, this leads to emotional overload, where the nervous system becomes saturated with experiences that were never consciously chosen. The result is exhaustion that is not linked to activity level, but to emotional exposure. However, this same sensitivity that creates overload is also the source of extraordinary emotional intelligence when properly regulated. When boundaries are introduced, the entire system changes its function. Instead of absorbing all emotional input equally, the brain begins to categorize and filter emotional information. Not every emotional signal is processed as personal responsibility. Not every emotional environment is internalized. This filtering process allows the nervous system to conserve energy, reducing unnecessary emotional processing and freeing up cognitive and biological resources for recovery and stability. As emotional filtering improves, the internal simulation of others' emotions becomes less invasive and more observational. The individual still understands emotional states deeply, but they no longer fully absorb them. This shift transforms sensitivity from a burden into a structured form of perception. Instead of being overwhelmed by emotional data, the system begins to analyze it. This creates clarity where there was once confusion and stability where there was once overload. The nervous system no longer operates in constant reaction mode, but in measured response mode. Another important transformation occurs when emotional boundaries become consistent. The brain begins to rewire its default response to emotional environments. Instead of immediate internal absorption, there is a moment of pause. In that pause, evaluation happens. The system decides whether to engage, observe, or release. This small shift dramatically reduces biological stress because not every emotional input triggers a full physiological response. Over time, this reduces cortisol spikes, stabilizes heart rate variability, and improves overall nervous system balance. The long-term effect of this regulation is profound. Emotional energy is no longer constantly drained by external environments. Sleep becomes more restorative because the mind is no longer processing excessive emotional residue at night. Mental clarity improves because cognitive resources are not divided between self-processing and absorbed emotional processing. The individual begins to feel more present, not because sensitivity is reduced, but because it is organized and contained. Conclusion begins here. The first solution is awareness that emotional absorption is not identity. It is a neurological response that can be regulated. The second is practicing emotional separation, where observation replaces internalization in social environments. The third is strengthening mental boundaries so that emotional input is filtered before it becomes physiological stress. The final step is consistency in maintaining these boundaries, because over time they retrain the nervous system to remain stable, clear, and resilient even in emotionally intense environments. Emotional boundaries are not a psychological preference. They are a biological necessity that directly shapes how the nervous system ages, repairs, and sustains itself over time. When emotional boundaries are weak or inconsistent, the brain operates as if every external emotional signal is personally relevant. This means that other people's stress, frustration, sadness, or instability is not just observed, it is internalized. The nervous system begins to treat external emotional environments as internal states, which forces the body into constant adaptation. Instead of maintaining a stable baseline, the system is repeatedly adjusting to emotional fluctuations that do not originate from within. Over time, this creates a chronic state of internal instability that drains biological resources far more than most people realize. When boundaries are absent, the body enters a pattern of emotional over-responsibility. The individual unconsciously feels responsible for regulating the emotional states of others, which leads to constant monitoring, reacting, and adjusting. This sustained emotional engagement activates stress pathways in the brain, even in situations that are not directly threatening. The nervous system cannot distinguish between genuine survival threats and emotionally charged environments, so it responds with the same biological mechanisms. Cortisol increases, heart rate variability decreases, and the body shifts into a low-grade survival mode that persists throughout daily life. This state is not dramatic or immediately noticeable, but it is deeply corrosive over time. One of the most damaging effects of weak emotional boundaries is the loss of internal separation between self and environment. Without boundaries, emotional experiences from others become stored internally as if they belong to the self. This creates emotional saturation, where the nervous system is processing far more input than it was designed to handle. The brain becomes cluttered with unresolved emotional data, replaying conversations, interpreting tones, and analyzing interactions long after they have ended. This prevents full recovery because the system never truly exits emotional processing mode. Even during rest, the mind continues to process emotional residue, preventing deep neurological restoration. As this pattern continues, the body begins to show signs of cumulative stress. Sleep becomes less restorative because the brain remains partially active, continuing emotional evaluation even during rest cycles. Muscle tension becomes chronic because the body is subtly preparing for emotional engagement at all times. Digestion can become irregular because the nervous system prioritizes alertness over internal maintenance. These changes are not sudden, they accumulate slowly, creating a baseline of fatigue that the individual may normalize without recognizing its origin. However, emotional boundaries are not about becoming detached or emotionally unavailable. They are about creating a clear distinction between observation and absorption. When boundaries are strong, emotional information is still perceived, but it is no longer automatically internalized. The brain learns to recognize emotional signals without converting them into physiological stress responses. This allows the nervous system to remain stable even in emotionally charged environments. Instead of reacting automatically, there is a pause, a moment of evaluation where the system determines relevance before response. That pause is where regulation begins. With consistent emotional boundaries, the nervous system gradually recalibrates. Stress responses become more proportional rather than automatic. Emotional interactions no longer trigger prolonged physiological reactions. The body begins to conserve energy that was previously spent on unnecessary emotional processing. This conserved energy is redirected toward repair, recovery, and cognitive clarity. Over time, this shift produces noticeable changes in both mental and physical states. The mind feels less cluttered, and the body feels less burdened. Another important transformation occurs in relationship dynamics. Without boundaries, relationships often become emotionally imbalanced. where one person absorbs significantly more emotional weight than the other. This creates cycles of exhaustion, resentment, and burnout. With boundaries in place, emotional exchange becomes more balanced. The individual is still empathetic, but not self-sacrificing. They can engage deeply without losing internal stability. This balance prevents long-term emotional depletion and supports healthier, more sustainable connections. Biologically, this shift has long-term consequences for aging. A regulated nervous system experiences fewer prolonged stress spikes, which means reduced cortisol exposure over time. Lower cortisol levels support healthier inflammation responses, improved sleep quality, and more efficient cellular repair processes. These are foundational mechanisms that influence how quickly or slowly the body ages. In this way, emotional boundaries become one of the most powerful internal regulators of biological aging. Conclusion begins here. The first solution is to consciously recognize emotional boundaries as a biological protection system, not an emotional limitation. The second is to practice separating observation from absorption in real-time social interactions. The third is to consistently reinforce internal stability by refusing to take responsibility for emotions that are not self-generated. The final step is long-term repetition of these behaviors, because sustained boundary practice retrains the nervous system to remain calm, efficient, and biologically protected under emotional pressure.